All right, we'll call to order the House Committee on Labor. Can we do a roll call? Or check in? What do we have for members here present? Should we do a check in? Or do we need to, Mike?
Mr. Chair, I think we're able to go and see everybody who's on the call.
Okay, good to go then. Okay, our agenda tonight, we have 3 bills. First one is House File 63 from Representative Stephenson. It's a shared work plan eligibility modified. Representative Stephenson, I will move House File 63 be referred to the General Register. And go ahead and present your bill, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Members of the committee, this bill relates to the shared work program. In case you, like I, was unfamiliar with this program before this bill, let me give you a brief synopsis. That program is administered by our Unemployment Insurance Division and allows employers to divide available hours of work among a group of employees instead of implementing a full layoff. These employees may then receive partial unemployment insurance benefits while working reduced hours. So, for example, if an employer needs to cut 10% of their labor costs, instead of laying off 10% of their workforce, they could reduce the hours of their entire workforce by 10%, and then those employees could gain partial unemployment insurance benefits to mitigate their wage loss. The benefits of this program for business is that it allows them to keep experienced and trained staff. It allows them to avoid future hiring and training costs. It allows them to increase operations quickly when business conditions improve, and allows them to avoid a layoff, which creates goodwill and financial stability in the workforce and the community. The employer manages the plan, but they submit for approval to DEED. Health and pension plans have to continue the same as before the shared work plan for affected employees. All employees must be full-time or part-time. They can't be seasonal or temporary. And under Minnesota law, they have to have been with the employer for at least 1 year prior to the start of the plan. And it's that last requirement that this bill modifies. This bill would change that requirement from 1 year with the employer down to 3 months. This bill came to me from a constituent who's lived in Minnesota for many years, but he's only been with his current employer for 8 months. And so he can't participate in the shared work plan that his employer has implemented, which means he's just lost wages without having any ability to recoup any of the unemployment insurance benefits. The 12-month requirement is actually the most restrictive requirement in the country for shared work plans. No other state has a 1-year requirement. Many states, including Arkansas, Kansas, Maine, Missouri, Nebraska, Rhode Island, all have no length of employment requirement at all. This bill takes a middle road approach. It temporarily reduces the length of employment requirement to 3 months. That's consistent with our neighbors in Wisconsin, as well as Maryland, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. It's on a temporary basis with a sunset at the end of calendar year 2020 because I wasn't sure how much it would cost when I was drafting the bill, and I thought that a sunset at the end of the year might mean that we could pay for any increased costs through the CARES Act money. But when I got the fiscal note back, I got a very pleasant surprise, which is that unrelated federal legislation passed earlier this year, and the federal government is picking up the entire cost of shared work plans for the duration of 2020. So accordingly, this bill has no fiscal cost to the state at all.
You
Zero
guys just go.
We're coming.
No.
It doesn't
I'm on
spend
a
any
conference.
general fund dollars, nor does it spend any CARES Act money to make this benefit eligible to more Minnesotans. I'm not aware of any opposition to the bill. We had an informational hearing in the Jobs Committee a couple weeks ago, and I received no negative feedback. With that, Mr. Chair, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Certainly. Thank you, Representative Stephenson. Are there any questions for the representative? Well, hearing none, I'm going to renew my motion.
Looks like Representative Mecklin has a question.
Representative Mecklin, then. Please.
Thank you, Chair Sundin. Question for Representative Stephenson. Is who tracks all this? I mean, how do you know, like, okay, let's just give it a hypothetical. If somebody does get laid off, like after they're being a shared employee, 2 months later, who's tracking what employer owns what part of the ownership of the cost of said unemployment insurance, if you will, if you can help me understand that.
Representative Stephenson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative Mecklen, I would, my initial assumption would be the answer to that question is deed, since they have tracking the shared work plan and admit it and then paying it out through the unemployment insurance division. But I'm happy to follow up with deed along with you to try and get you a better answer to that question.
Representative Mecklen.
Thank you, Chair Sundin. So, Representative Stephenson, would like this require more staff for deed to accomplish this, as far as tracking all this? I mean, because all paperwork, it obviously takes time. We all dislike it, right? So, to me, I'm just trying to wrap my brain around, like, if you have a shared employee, which I enjoy that concept in my world, where I can share, subcontractors. But would the deed be required to hire more people to track all this? And so, I mean, I know there's no fiscal note, and I get that. But who's going to take on this additional labor to track all of this? If you could help me understand that.
Representative Stephenson.
Mr. Chair, Representative Mecklen, there's no additional hires. The fiscal note makes clear that the deed would be able to do any administrative work with their existing staff. Keep in mind that it's not an expansion of the program because the employers can choose to participate whether or not all of their employees have been there for a year or 8 months or 3 months or whatever it is. It just allows people who currently are in a shared work plan, their businesses are doing it, to access the benefits if they've been there for 3 months instead of 12. So no, it wouldn't result in any new hires at deed. That's explained in the fiscal note, which I'm happy to, I don't know if that was provided to the committee, but I'm happy to send you a copy, Representative Mecklen.
Representative Mecklen, anything further?
No, thank you, Representative Stevens. I think that cleared it up, and I do see the language here, so I appreciate your explaining it. Thank you.
Okay. Any further questions for Representative Stephenson and House File 63?
Chair, Representative Detmer has a question.
Representative Detmer, please.
Okay, there we go. If I was an employer thinking about the unemployment taxes, will this affect the taxes of the on the employer if this passes?
Representative Stephenson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Representative Detmer. The answer is no, because the federal government is picking up the entire tab of shared work for the duration of this year. So it's not coming out of the Unemployment Trust Fund, it's coming out of the federal government.
Okay. Thank you.
Representative Detmer, anything else?
That's good. Thank you. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Any other questions regarding House File 63?
Mr. Chair, Fabian here.
Representative Fabian, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So just a couple of real quick questions. I want to be clear on the sunset for the end of this year and why is it sunsetting this year?
Representative Stephenson.
Mr. Chair, Representative Fabian, that is the end of when the federal government is picking up the cost of shared work plans. So there's no cost if we only go to the end of the year. There may be a cost if it goes beyond the end of the year.
Representative Fabian.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And that's the end of this calendar year, correct? 2020.
Representative Stephenson.
Mr. Chair, Fabian, yes.
Thank you. And then real quickly, how many businesses or employers are participating in a shared work program, and how many employees are participating in a shared work program?
Representative Stephenson.
Mr. Chair, Representative Fabian, I've asked those questions of deed and am awaiting a response.
Representative Fabian, anything further?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Just one last question. What's going on with this over, and I'm not supposed to mention the chamber across the street, but I'm curious to know about what's going on in the Senate with this, and what conversations has the author had with the Senate.
Representative Stephenson.
Mr. Chair, Representative Fabian, Senator Rarick is carrying the bill in the Senate. It's been introduced. I had a good conversation with Senator Pratt, who told me he was open to hearing the bill, and I understand Senator Rarick has also had conversations with Senator Pratt.
Senator Fabian,
Okay,
any further?
Nope, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Any further questions on House File 63? Hearing none, I will renew my motion that House File 63 be referred to the General Register. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, that motion prevails. Thank you very much, Representative Stephenson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I hope you enjoy the testimony of my brilliant and fantastic police chief in Coon Rapids, who will be coming up later on, Chief Wise. He's excellent.
Thank you. We're going to be entertaining Senate File 15. Representative Tabke is attached to this one regarding youth unemployment or youth employment. There's a technical change made to a bill that we already passed earlier this year. I think it was referred to as the Fabian bill. Deals with amusement rides and lawn equipment. So I will move the bill, Senate File 15, to be referred to the General Register. Representative Tabke, can you explain your bill?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair and members. Yeah, this is a problem with the effective date in the drafting of the bill, and so we need to make this technical change. If we don't make this, the bill will go into effect as it would on August 1st. But right now, a lot of lawn care companies as well as amusement parks are working on hiring folks as we come, as they are allowed to do that. And so we would like to make this change retroactive back to May 28th when the bill was enacted. So all the bill does is change the effective date to the day after enactment.
Okay, any questions to the representative on the Senate File 15? Okay, hearing none, I'm going to renew the motion that Senate File 15 be referred to the General Register. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed,
Aye.
Those opposed, nay. Hearing none, the motion prevails. Thank you very much,
Thank you.
Representative Tabke. Next up is House File 72, Representative Herr, bill regarding peace officer grievance, arbitrator selection, amended, and rulemaking authorized. I will move your bill, House File 72, be referred to the Committee on Ways and Means. Representative Herr, would you please explain your bill?
Thank you,
You have an amendment, excuse me.
Yes.
I'll move the amendment first then. All those in, going to explain the amendment?
Yes, Chair. So this amendment actually puts the bill in the order that we would like to. This is based on feedback that was given to us. And so this bill now, it just makes clear that the arbitrators in this new appointed process will only be doing arbitration for those who are not peace officers. And we're changing the number of arbitrators in this new group from 25 to 26. And then it just says that those appointed from this process for peace officers, it's just that those on this roster will only hear grievance arbitration cases for peace officers.
Okay, any questions on the amendment? Okay, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Aye.
Okay, the motion has been adopted. You have some testifiers for House File 72 then?
I do, Chair. Would you like me to do my opening first? Or would you like to have the testifiers go first?
You go right ahead with your presentation of the bill.
Thank you, Chair Sundin. Thank you, Chair and committee members. For the record, I am Representative Kali Herr, and I will be speaking to the Peace Officer Grievance Arbitration Selection Procedure, which is House File 72. I want to start by saying that I'm here today before all of you to make changes to a system that allowed an individual empowered to serve and protect to kill a Black man, George Floyd, in broad daylight. It would be disrespectful and untruthful if I said this killing brought to light huge and systemic problems in our police structure. You see, the unequal treatment of enforcement and justice has been something well known in Black, Brown, Indigenous, and people of color communities for a really long time. The only difference at this time is that we have proof of these inequities. Part of the problem stems from the police arbitration process. The current arbitration system for peace officers provides a financial incentive for arbitrators to side 50-50 with employer-employee. That is because the arbitrators are more likely to be selected by the parties if they have had that kind of a track record. This amended bill, House File 72, seeks to address this situation by modifying how and which arbitrators are used in peace officer grievance arbitration by establishing an arbitrator selection procedure. These changes apply to all peace officer grievance arbitrations for written disciplinary action, discharge, or termination, and must be included in the grievance procedure for all collective bargaining agreements covering peace officer negotiated on or after the enactment date. So with that, Chair Sandine, I would like to ask, I have three testifiers ready to testify, and I can introduce them if you're ready to hear.
Would you please do so? Go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Our first testifier is Chief Brad Weiss of Coon Rapids.
Chief Wise, would you just identify yourself for the record and proceed with your testimony on House File 72?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Brad Wise. I'm the police chief for the city of Coon Rapids. Actually, I appreciate the opportunity to present to you and members of your committee talking about a change in the grievance arbitration procedure. I think the problems with grievance arbitration are well known, as was pointed out by Representative Herr. And I think the problems fundamentally were unintentional, meaning the arbitration statute was written to cover both interest and grievance arbitrations. And while the current selection process for arbitrators in interest arbitrations, in my view, works perfectly, the selection process for grievance arbitrations becomes problematic. And I've been a student of the arbitration process for a long time. I've been police chief for 9 years. I've been very engaged in making myself an expert on Minnesota's process. If any of you are interested in, say, the newspaper version, DJ Tice, columnist for the Star Tribune, has written about police arbitrations for a number of years, 30 years. And his data is unimpeachable. And his data says that 30 years ago, 50% of police terminations were overturned in arbitration. And last year, 50% of terminations were overturned via arbitration. Statistically speaking, it's just not possible. Speaking for any police chief in the state of Minnesota, before any termination case would go to arbitration, we put a tremendous amount of effort into documenting both the incidents that led to the potential termination, but also the process, the lawful process, because professionally speaking, and all of you as well, respect due process. We respect due process rights that were given to unions, and that there's nothing wrong with extending due process to anyone under any circumstance. What experience has shown, however, is that the way the current system is written, the way the statute is written and the rules are written for a grievance arbitration, when a grievance is brought to the Bureau of Mediation Services, Bureau of Mediation Services will send a list of 7 available arbitrators. From that list of 7, each side, meaning the employer and then the employee, will take turns striking one name from the list until one arbitrator remains. And the way arbitrators are not a full-time position, arbitrators are contractors that are paid by the arbitration. So truthfully, they have a financial incentive to being selected. If I don't get selected, I don't earn a living. So I have this incentive to be selected. And it doesn't take a lot of deep thinking to realize that if I have, for example, 4 pro-employer decisions in a row in my most recent arbitrations is that the employee is likely to strike me from the list as being too pro-employer, and the converse is true. And so what winds up happening is that each side takes turns striking one name from the list until the one person who remains is the one person who has a 50-50 or an even split on decisions. And the arbitrators who weren't selected, and I'm not saying that they're trying to, that arbitrators would manipulate their decision-making process. I'm just saying I think the system would be well served if there weren't a financial incentive to being selected. And I think Representative Herr's bill is going to prescribe a process whereby an eligible list of arbitrators who are specifically trained for police matters will be randomly selected when a grievance is brought to the Bureau of Mediation Services. So I'll stand for any questions, but I guess that would be my initial statement.
Thank you very much, Chief Wise. Can we go on with the testifiers, and then we'll open it up for questions afterwards. So I guess next we have Chief Mike Tuscan from the Duluth Police Department. Please identify yourself and proceed with your testimony.
Thank you, Chair. And yeah, my name is Mike Tuscan. I've served as the police chief for the city of Duluth for about the last 5 years. Chief Wise hit the nail on the head. He covered all of my speaking points, and I don't want to be redundant, to be respectful of your time. I will tell you that I am at times very frustrated with the arbitration system for many of the reasons that were cited. There is a financial benefit for arbitrators to split the baby, if you will. And we see this. And the selection process, that essentially a preemptory challenge, they just remove, and you're set with an arbitrator that everyone can agree on. While that sounds fundamentally fair, it is flawed in as much as there are people on each side, both that represents the employer and the employee, who will remove people that they don't believe they're going to get due process from. And so my frustration most recently was a case where we terminated an employee for dragging a gentleman down the skywalk 90 feet, hitting his head on the door. And ultimately, we had that overturned in arbitration. We took it to the district court level, the appeal court level, and the Supreme Court level. And ultimately, we did not prevail and was reinstated. And so in law enforcement, so much is at stake in our communities, so much. And we see that most recently. And I routinely talk about the social contract and the importance of building trust in our organizations. And many times my community will reach out to me when there is what they see an injustice in an arbitration process, and said, well, Chief, why didn't you, if you really were advocating for us, why didn't you then terminate the employee? And they don't necessarily understand that while I may have terminated the employee, the due process component brought them back. And even though I exhausted appeals, it really rings hollow with them about how hard we worked to uphold that social contract, to speak to the importance of us being fair and impartial and showing compassion and care in our work. Now, we know that the vast majority of people who do this job do it for the right reasons, but we do have people in this profession that we should not have. And the police chief is best positioned to make those decisions with their command staff. And the current process right now really makes me, and I know other chiefs around the state, feel hamstrung by the inability to decide who will be serving your communities. And with that, I will yield back to the chair and the other testimony. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief Tuscan. Appreciate your comments. Next up, we have Pat Beatty, General Counsel for the League of Minnesota Cities. Please, again, identify yourself and then proceed with your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good evening. I'm Patricia Beatty. I am General Counsel for the League of Minnesota Cities. Prior to assuming the General Counsel position, I was a litigator for the League's insurance trust for 25 years. There, I defended Minnesota cities in employment-related matters in state and federal court. And during this time, I saw far too many important employment decisions taken out of the hands of the public employer. Those city officials responsible for public safety, including experienced, reform-minded police chiefs. I want to start by saying that unions have a place. Unions play an important role in representing the interests of employees and their members. However, the current arbitration system, right now, the public employers do not have a final say over the continued employment of those employees who have significantly breached their employers and the community's trust. In numerous cases, the third-party arbitrator has been able to lawfully second-guess a police chief's discipline decision, reverse, reduce discipline, reinstate terminated officers based on the arbitrator's sense of what is right or best. This has resulted in final decisions that cannot be vacated or successfully challenged in the courts. Decisions left to stand without regard to the significant risks and impacts on the police operations, community relations, and even the future physical safety of those who the police officials are sworn to protect. There were cases involving police officers lying on official reports, failing to report use of force as required by city policy, or using unlawful or excessive force on citizens. And even in those cases where there were multiple offenses of an individual officer shown lying or neglect of duty or violation of use of force policies, the arbitrator still issued an order to reinstate the offending officer over strong objections by the police chief, the HR director, the city manager, and sometimes even over the objection of other union members. It has been the long-standing policy of the League of Minnesota Cities to support a new process in these employee misconduct matters, one that will allow the public employer to bypass the mandatory arbitration process required currently under Minnesota Statute 179A, Impelra is what we call it. The League supports House File 72 to the extent that it provides a new and better process for arbitrator selection in police discipline proceedings, but additional reform is needed. The current arbitration system under Impel would largely remain intact and continue to perpetuate the significant problem of those untouchable arbitration orders because of the near impossibility of vacating them in the court system. The policy that's explicitly stated in Impel in the statute right now makes the rights of citizens paramount. And without significant further reform, the current system will still allow an arbitrator, whoever that may be, to undermine this policy. A policy that should be balanced in favor of health, safety, and welfare of citizens over that of the public employee accused of misconduct. So without further reform, our police chiefs, our local officials would continue to have the possibility being thwarted in their affirmative duty to protect their communities and undermine these rigorous employer accountability, transparency standards that are trying to be implemented and are needed now more than ever. The League has several other ideas for further changes to the current arbitration process, both in the statute and under the rules. And as I said, we support House File 72, but we look forward to working with you and other legislatures to accomplish some significant, meaningful change. And I will stand for questions.
Any questions for the testifier? Thank you very much.
Mr. Chair, we have Representative Detmer.
Representative Detmer, please.
Yeah, I have a question for the author, Representative Kerr. What if the police officer is also a veteran? You know, we have a lot of veterans that come off the military as military police and so forth, and they get involved in our law enforcement, and we have veteran preferences. I know the last several years, the Minnesota Department of Veterans Affairs worked through these veteran preferences when it comes to arbitration. Does your bill affect veteran preferences. Or if you don't know, if you could maybe contact the Department of Veterans Affairs and see how this ties in with veteran preferences. And I know we have some great people that have served our nation and have got into law enforcement. So I have a question. That was my question. If you could check into that.
Representative Herr, any response?
Chair, Representative Detmer, thank you for the question. I didn't specifically look at this because and I don't know if the veterans preference is stated in statute in PELRA, because this particular piece of legislation does not go through PELRA. It goes to through chapter 626, which is actually a different section of statute. And so I will check into that just to make sure. But you know, if the preference is through PELRA, it actually doesn't impact any of that at all.
Well, I appreciate that. I don't serve on the next committee, so if you could get back to me, I'd appreciate it.
Okay, I will do that. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Mr. Chair, next up we have Representative Michael V. Nelson, and following that is Representative Meckland.
Okay, Representative Nelson, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative Herr, I want to thank you for limiting it to the police officers. They have extraordinary powers, and maybe they need to have different set of arbitration rules. But as a former public employee and a former business agent for my union that represented public and private employees, the arbitration process is there to protect the employees from sometimes from some management that go overboard and act like they act differently. And so we need the process, and I'm glad that we didn't go after PELRA, because those are there to protect the union employees. They have the right to form unions. They have the right to have the representation they want. And we shouldn't be going after the unions on this. The union officials have to represent their employees. Otherwise, they can be sued by the employees if they don't properly represent their employees in these issues, especially grievance issues and or discipline issues. They can be held liable for inaction on their part. So I want to thank you for limiting this to the police officers, because they are a different group of employees that have extraordinary powers that we grant them. We should be able to make sure that we're holding them accountable.
Thank you, Representative Nelson. Representative Meckland, questions?
Actually, yeah, a couple. Thank you, Chair Sundin. So in response to what Representative Nelson just said, I think a lot of unions always have a lot of power over a lot of people, including teachers. But that's not my question. So my question is to Representative Herr. Is there not a reason why we could not do this to allow, like, Minneapolis City Council and the mayor and St. Paul and those to institute these programs on whatever fits best for their areas, because we don't see this problem everywhere. And why do we want to make a statewide policy? And my second question is going to be to the Chief Weiss and Tuscan. If I said Weiss right, I'm sorry if I didn't. But don't you think local control would be better for what you see in your communities rather than a statewide blanket policy that covers everything, that creates a whole lot of paperwork for a lot of people? And if all you could answer, I would greatly appreciate it. Thank you.
Would the author please respond first?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Rep. Is it Melkin? I couldn't see your whole name. Thank you for the question, and I think that is a really legitimate question. But we know that actually this is not a Minneapolis-St. Paul issue. When Philando Castile was killed, he was killed by St. Anthony police officers. We've had incidents in Hopkins, really high-profile incident, which Representative Howard has been trying to address and seek justice for a really long time. We see actually this all over, and I can just say that from my own personal self, that the times in which I'm actually profiled the most as a woman of color is actually when I leave the Twin Cities. And so I think that it would be erroneous for us to say that this is a Minneapolis-St. Paul issue and just leave it to them to address. That we know that this is a statewide issue, and this is actually a nationwide issue, which is why thousands of people are in the streets marching and protesting, which is why there are protests across the world, because this is an issue that is not Minneapolis and St. Paul focused.
I understand Chief Weiss or Tuscan could respond as well to the questions.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, Representative Macklin. Yes, well, actually, the changes that are being proposed under grievance arbitration related to police is really just the manner in which the arbitrator is chosen. And we're trying to remove there being a financial incentive to a 50-50 portfolio of decisions. And truthfully, that removing that financial incentive is something that needs to apply statewide. And actually, you can, if you went to the Bureau of Mediation Services website and look through some of the arbitration decisions that are related to law enforcement, and I'll give you a good example to, you'll get a sense of the kind of decisions that are being made. But one of the things Representative Hers is touching on is, and Chief Tuscan in Duluth is touching on, is the significance of use of force policy violations and that they needed to be treated more seriously. So Blaine, the city of Blaine, successfully terminated an employee in 2019. And that issue was related to overtime. And the overtime issue was the officer didn't want to work overtime, didn't want to work mandatory overtime. And he manipulated the software within the department so that he somehow got excluded from their overtime provisions. That officer was successfully terminated. Meanwhile, the Richfield case and the Duluth case regarding use of force, excessive use of force, both of those employees won their job back. And I would like to see arbitrators have law enforcement specific training so that that their training would underline the importance of what matters to the community. The employee in Blaine probably should have likely remained terminated due to his dishonesty, but police, I assure you, every police chief is far more concerned about somebody who has trouble controlling their temper than they do about somebody trying to manipulate a system so they don't have forced overtime on the 4th of July. So those are my comments. Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Representative Tuscan, would you like to weigh in on the question?
Chief.
Indeed. Yep. Chief, I maybe representative, maybe when my career's over. So yeah, it is, again, I follow Chief Wise, and he is well read on this issue, as am I. When we look at the arbitrated decisions, they are head scratchers at times. Some of the employees, some of the police officers that are losing their jobs are, in my opinion, for far less than a use of force issue or a substantial breach of public trust, where there's outrage in your community, where you erode public trust. It has a detrimental impact, not just for days or weeks or months, but it can go on for years. And so it is so hard for us. We work so hard to build trust and relationships and engage our community. And it only takes one incident of use of force that's excessive. And oftentimes it is against people who are people of color. And we work so hard in those communities to build relationships and trust, and it can be swept away in a moment. The process in place right now is truly flawed. And we have to look at, as much as I want to see every single employee get due process, I also know that there is a tremendous amount at stake every time we go to arbitration. I agree, and I can't remember the representative's name that talked about, there are times where you may have an overzealous boss that may be using his position to impose his will or to impact your employment. Our arbitrations that we're going to are because there are a substantial breach of public trust. There are violations of code of conduct that we say is not acceptable in our profession. We have to have integrity and honor, and we have to do our jobs because we're a monopoly, and you don't get to call the other police department maybe outside your jurisdiction because you like them better. That means we need to show up every day at our best and be our best. And if we have employees who cannot self-regulate, especially when there's times when use of force is needed, that absolutely erodes public trust, and that will always impact our ability to provide safe communities when the very citizens we rely on to work in partnership to keep our community safe have turned their back on us. And this is the problem I've seen for years, and this is something I think we absolutely have to address and have a process where there is truly a fair outcome. And I'll yield. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chief Tuscan. Any other questions for the testifiers? Any other comments from the committee?
Mr. Chair, it looks like
Chair Sundin, I'm still here.
Oh, is that Mecklen? Representative Mecklen?
Thank you, Chair Sundin.
Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry.
It's okay. I understand. It's getting late, right? We got one more to do yet tonight. So I appreciate everything I've heard from both of these chiefs of police. And I also believe both of you two know your communities better than anyone. And that's where I'm concerned about a one-size-fits-all kind of blanket thing throughout the state. We all know what we need to do. We all know we don't like what's been going on. And that's part of my concern. But with that, I'm also going to say, I would like to ask for a roll call.
Currently, a roll call has been called for. We will do that. Any other comments, Representative Mecklen?
No, I'm good. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Chief Tuscan, did you have other comments?
Yeah, you know, and if I didn't answer the question, it is not a problem that's specific to the metro area. I mean, I'm 150 miles up in northern Minnesota here where everything is perfect, we know. But the reality is these problems, we talk to chiefs across every corner of the state. They have same and similar problems. We cannot have local control and rely on local control to change policies that impact the entire state and statewide. We need to be leaders in Minnesota. We need to have a policy and practices in place that will allow us to do our work honorably. It will allow us to be able to decide who gets to serve that community on their worst day or moment of their lives. And it also is not a removing due process. It's a change in what due process looks like, a change in how we select those arbitrators. But I will assure you, with the over 400 chiefs of police across the state who we meet every year at conventions and have conversations with, this is a problem not just in the metro area, but in rural Minnesota as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief Tuscan.
Mr.
Okay.
Chair, Brad Wise, could I one last
Go
comment?
ahead. Go ahead, Chief Weiss.
Yeah, and Chief Tuscan mentioned that due process is unchanged, and a terminated employee will still be entitled to due process. The other thing that I like a lot about this particular bill is that no labor agreement, no existing labor agreement will need to be changed. The language can remain the same between the union and the cities.
Thank you for that clarification. Any other questions for the testifiers or the author from the committee?
Mr. Chair.
Chair.
Mr. Chair.
Representative Hartstein.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair and members. I just wanted to thank Representative Herr for this bill. And I just want to say, you know, here in Minneapolis, I'm getting a lot of constituent interest and concern, quite frankly, about the union, which I don't think functions like a traditional union. And I think it is very much an impediment to the kinds of deep systemic changes that we need to make in policing here in Minneapolis and around the state. So I think this is an important first step, and I strongly support the bill.
Mr. Chair, Representative Vogel has a question. And members, please stay on the call after roll call of this bill. We have to go back and do roll call on the previous two bills. I'm sorry about that. Thank you.
Representative Vogel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I know there was discussion before that this shouldn't be necessary for all public union employees, and I looking at this and I'm thinking, you know, I think all of us are horrified by what happened in Minneapolis. I also think that we're singling out now a single group of people that, for the most part, for the very most part, are doing their job and trying to come home safely at night. And therefore, the question to Representative Herr is, why aren't we applying this to other groups with the same method? Because I think it's only right, whether it be a teacher or a social worker or whatever. I think you're absolutely right that we should be looking at the grievance provisions and making sure that we're doing this right. And if we are doing this right, and there are people that happen to be in other professions, but are also having public contact. And, you know, there's obviously the physical abuse, which we just saw, which is putrid, but there's also emotional, psychological abuse that can happen. And that can happen with different types of employees as well. So my question is, why are we just doing this for this one group? I realize it's in front of us right now, but if we really intend to correct the problem, don't we want to dig into this a little deeper and make sure that we're really getting at the heart of the problem and that we're protecting all people?
Representative Herr.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the question, Representative Vogel. So the reason why this is limited to just peace officer is because they are the only public employee that we give a gun to, and we tell them that they have the right to take someone's life for whatever circumstance they may be in. They can use that gun. And so it is very clear to us that that is a very different standard than other public employees. And should we come into situations in which other people's lives are at risk in the same way? We absolutely should. And just like we should actually look at private companies for not just public employees. Private company employees hurt people too, but we don't have any systems in place for that either. And so I think that you're absolutely right, because we do live in a system, in a structure, and in a country that was built on has created systemic racism in all of our structures and all of our institutions. And so because it is such a big task in front of us, we should focus on the thing that is at hand right now, and that is that the arbitration process for police officers does not work. And that it half the time puts people back into jobs that shouldn't be there. And there are dire consequences to when those officers stay on the job. So I appreciate your question, and I think that it's one for us to ponder on, but that is not what is before us now. And so that's why we're limiting it to police officers.
Thank you, Representative Herr. Representative Vogel,
thank you,
anything further?
Well, Mr. Chair, I guess the question to Representative Herr is, let's take the example of a teacher that might emotionally abuse a student, and they get to the point of suicide. Now, I'm not suggesting that happens very often, but it could happen. And that's why I'm saying, if we're going to do this, let's look at the broad thing of what we're doing and let's do it right. And I think there are other cases. You don't necessarily have to have a gun in your hand to disturb somebody or to have them violence to either themselves or others. So my question is, do you think that this just can be limited to somebody that's holding a gun, or is it somebody else that could be just as abusive in a different way, and that we should look at that system as well?
Chair and Representative Vogel, I can't answer that question except for to say that I can't imagine what George Floyd's family would be feeling right now hearing this conversation. That we are comparing the death of a Black man killed at the hands of police and a system that this isn't the first time this has happened, a system that continues to do this to Black and brown people. And that you would sit here and compare that to a teacher. I'm not saying a teacher's emotional abuse of a student is not awful. I actually worked in the school district, and I did oversee when there were, at times when there were issues with teachers who were not good teachers, and that those teachers would be put on performance. Principal would watch that teacher's performance for improvement. They would be put on a plan, and then if that teacher didn't improve, they could fire that teacher. And so this is not an issue in other areas right now. And if it becomes one, we should absolutely look at it. But I would just ask for us to think about when we compare the life of a human being to something that we think, well, it's equally important. Yeah, it's important. But I just think about what it means for George Floyd's family for us to watch now to say, oh, well, his life was as important as potentially that a teacher who can get fired might be doing to a student. I would just ask for us to think of it from that perspective.
Thank you, Representative Hurd. Any further comments, Representative Vogel?
Well, Mr. Chair and Representative Herr, I wasn't looking at race. I was looking at what we're doing in legislation. I'm sorry if I offended. It wasn't meant to offend. It was meant to look at what we're doing here and making sure if we're going to do things that we do it the best we can. So if I offended, I apologize, but that wasn't the intent. The intent was to look at the legislation in front of us and make sure it's as good for the people of Minnesota as it can be. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Representative Vogel. Any further questions for the testifiers or the author?
Chair Sundin, I did get an answer to Representative Detmer's question about veterans preference. Would you like me to, can I share
Please,
that?
Representative Herb, please fill us in.
Yes, and let me just pull it up here real quick, and I'm so sorry. I did have a chance to look at that, and it looks, so the bill in veterans preference is not addressed in this bill, so it wouldn't be impacted. So veterans preference would not be impacted.
So, Mr. Chair, so that means that the veterans preference would supersede this legislation?
From what I understand, yes, Representative.
Hello.
Mr. Chair.
It's like we lost our chair.
Yes, we lost the chair.
Vice Chair Cagle, would you like to take over?
I guess I can do that. So I don't see any other hands here. Is there any other questions? I actually wanted just to thank
This is Representative Fabian. I have some questions. I'm sorry. I'm on my phone. I don't have hands function.
Representative Fabian.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate that. I was lost here for a minute too, just like Chair Sundin. I'm not sure what's going on here. So I have a question for the author of the bill. What's the definition of peace officers?
Representative Hurd?
Let me just take a look here real quick, because I think it does say that.
The chair has returned.
Oh, man.
The chair has returned. Okay. Representative Herr?
Yeah, so
explaining.
Yes, so there is a definition for peace officer, and that's defined under section 626.84 to 626.83. So it's a specific type of licensure. So it would be police officers, sheriffs. It would be anybody that would be considered in that line of work. And I don't actually have that specific part of that statute in front of me, but there is already a definition of that in statute.
Mr. Chair.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, I'm sorry that answer is not adequate for me. I apologize. I'm not interested in what the statute numbers are. I'm actually interested in specifically who's going to be affected by the bill. And it would seem to me that the author of the bill should know specifically who is going to be impacted by this. So to the author of the bill, again, I would ask, tell me specifically which peace officers would be impacted by the bill.
Sure, if you give me a second, I will look it up. So it actually is quite long. There are a number of provisions under this. So would you like for me to read you the entire thing, or would you like me to send you a link to the definition of peace officer?
No, you can read it.
An employee or an elected or appointed official of a political subdivision or law enforcement agency who is licensed by the board, charged with the prevention and detection of crime and the enforcement of the general criminal laws of the state, and who has the full power of arrest and shall also include the Minnesota State Patrol, agents of the Division of Alcohol and Gambling Enforcement, state conservation officers, metropolitan transit police officers, Department of Corrections, fugitive apprehension unit officers, and Department of Commerce fraud bureau unit officers, and statewide coordinators of the Violent Crime Coordinating Council, and a peace officer who is employed by law enforcement agency of a federally recognized tribe as defined in United States Code 25, Section 450BE, and who is licensed by the board. Part-time peace officers mean an individual licensed by the board whose services are utilized by law enforcement agencies no more than an average of 20 hours per week, not including time spent on call when no call or active duty is received, calculated on an annual basis, who is either full powers of arrest or authorization to carry a firearm while on active duty. The term shall apply even though the individual receives no compensation for time spent on active duty, and shall, irrespective of the title conferred upon the individual by any law enforcement agency. Reserve officer means an individual whose service are utilized by a law enforcement agency to provide supplementary assistance at special events, traffic or crowd control, and administrative or clerical assistance, and shall include reserve deputies, special deputies, mounted or unmounted patrols, and all other employees or volunteers performing reserve office functions. A reserve officer's duty to not include enforcement of the general criminal laws of the state, and the officer does not have the full powers of arrest or authorization to carry a firearm on duty. It goes on for a little bit longer. Would you like me to finish reading it?
No, I'm curious to know if that includes the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension.
Representative Herb.
From what I understand, so are you specifically referring to specific individuals within that bureau? Because I mean, not everybody in that bureau falls under these categories.
Mr. Chair, maybe this is something that House Research could help with.
That'd be terrific. Thank you. I'm flying blind here on the phone, so identify yourself when you speak, please.
Mr. Chair and members, this is Martha James from House Research. The provision that I am familiar with is in 626.84, which is what Representative Herr was referring to. I immediately, in looking at this contemporaneously, do not see the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension directly referred to, but I do not know for sure whether or not this would apply to the BCA. And so I can confirm that with a colleague who handles peace officer definitions.
So, Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So to the author of the bill, was it her intention to include the BCA?
Mr. Chair, Representative Fabian, I guess I just want to make sure I understand the question, because not everybody who works for the Bureau actually is a peace officer. So can I just get clarification that you're wondering if everybody in the Bureau is included in this, or just people who fall under the category, which I read the definitions of how they're certified and who has a firearm, who has, like, is that who you're referring to, or are you referring to everybody who works for the Bureau?
Mr. Chair?
Representative Fabian.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. No, it's not what my question is. It's what is your intention, Representative Herr. I want to know what your intention is with regards to BCA.
So my intention is that, sorry, thank you, Chair and Representative Fabian. My intention is that anybody who falls under the definition of a peace officer, which means if somebody here very specifically, they're speaking about how they are certified and whether they carry a firearm, or if they fall under these categories, then they would be covered. Now, I can get a much detail, if I understand what you're trying to ask me, because there are many employees who work for the Bureau. And so, like I said, I don't want to answer a question that doesn't seem to be clear to me the scope of who you're asking me about.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Fabian.
Okay, so here's the problem that I have with, we've talked about this in the past with regards to a lot of things. It's really, really difficult to vote on bills like this when we don't know the details and we're not meeting in person. We don't know what's going on with regards to the details of stuff that's in here. So, and to the Chiefs Weiss and Tuscan. Now, Tuscan said he's from northern Minnesota, but golly, is he north of Highway 2 or south of Highway 2? I'm not sure. So I'm just teasing a little bit. You know, guys, I listen, I'm a tremendous supporter of law enforcement, and you can ask anybody in my district that I represent, the chiefs and the sheriffs and so forth. You can talk to Colonel Langer and the guys at the State Patrol. My concern is that, you know, the inference is that this is a statewide problem, and Representative Herr said that this is not a Minneapolis and statewide problem. Mr. Chair, quite frankly, I've not heard a word from a single chief or sheriff in the district that I represent. I fail to see how this is going to be beneficial in a place like Cloquet, where you live, or in Rosa, where I live, or in International Falls, where Representative Eklund lives. I don't get it. And I spent 35 years teaching and coaching. I was worked here in Roseau. Representative Herr, I would ask you this. I've negotiated as a chief negotiator for the teachers in Roseau. I've negotiated a number of contracts. Can you tell me how many contracts you've negotiated in a collective bargaining setting for employees?
Representative Herr.
Thank you, Chair Sundin, and thank you, Representative Fabian, for that question. I actually came into the St. Paul School District when there was huge strife between the St. Paul School District, the teachers union, and the new board that was elected. And so I actually worked through an intensive year process of working with the both school district and the union during that time, during that contract negotiation. So though I have not had a lot of them, I have had experience doing it.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, Mr. Chair. I apologize. I really struggle with the concept of this. I don't like the fact that we are going to appear to be targeting police officers in this collective bargaining process and in this arbitration process, and I don't like that. I think that if we're going to open up this situation, we really need to take a look at doing it. If one size fits all, then we should be doing it for all arbitration type situations. I would ask the author of the bill, why are you reducing the number from 25? And you said in your opening comments 26, but I think you meant 6. Is that not correct?
Representative Herr.
Chair Sundin, Representative Fabian, we originally it said 25, but we are actually reducing that number to 6. So if I didn't say that earlier, that was I misspoke. That's actually what we're doing is.
Representative Fabian.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And so, Representative Herr, why are you having the governor appoint the 6? Why not the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court?
Representative Herr.
As an example.
Representative Fabian, we did look at that, and the ALJ does not have the type of expertise. With the appointment through the governor's office, it is a public appointment process, and that all of the same requirements for somebody's qualifications is what that office would follow in order to appoint somebody, and that our governor's public appointment process is generally a very fair process and broad process, and that it does reach community members and people within areas that we may not generally see. And so we did look at that as well, but we thought this was the best process.
Representative Fabian, anything further? Did you have anything further, Representative Fabian?
Oh.
Hello, anything further?
Oh, I'm not sure what's going on here. And again, I struggle with that. I think that we should find a more balanced way of appointing, if that's what we're going to do. It says in the bill something about in consultation with stakeholders. Who are the stakeholders in this process?
Representative Herr.
Chair Sundin, Representative Fabian, can you direct me to the specific section you're looking at, the specific language?
Oh boy, I'm going to have to go back there. I'm sorry. Hold on.
We're holding Representative Fabian.
Yeah. I'm going to have to look here while I'm going to ask one more question. You know, Representative Herr, you know, what happened in Minneapolis is a horrible, horrible, horrible tragedy. And I think universally people agree to that. you talked about the systemic racism that exists in all institutions. And again, I really struggle with that too, Representative Herr, with all due respect. Can you point out for me in Thief River Falls or someplace like that where the institutional racism is manifesting itself?
Representative Herr?
Chair Sundin, Representative Fabian, I would suggest that maybe you and I have a conversation another time regarding that huge topic because, right, like many things around systemic racism, unless you experience it, you're not going to be able to see it unless I can help point it out for you. And I would prefer for us to maybe have that be a private conversation between us, because that means that it tells me that right now, the way the question was asked, that there's very little understanding of privilege and power, very little understanding of the historical nature of our country and the laws we have put into place to exclude people of color. It tells me that there is no foundation for the idea of how this land was taken and the people that were killed and the people that the land was stolen from. And so I'm sorry, but I can't give you an answer today on that question during this time because it is a much bigger conversation that we should have.
Thank you, Representative Herr. Representative Fabian?
Last question would go back to, and I apologize to the person who is testifying on behalf of the League of Cities. Is
Bishop Beatty.
Are they still on board?
Yes. Go ahead.
So to the League of Cities, I'm curious to know. This is a bite out of an apple. If we do this, what is your intent going forward in terms of following up with something that goes to a broader scope? And also then back to the author too. I think if we're going to do something like this, we need to get away from the appearance, like I said earlier, of kind of targeting police. I go back to what Representative Detmer said. I believe it was him, about other employees who should possibly be, and maybe we should have a hearing on that, Mr. Chair. Why wouldn't we do that? Why wouldn't we have more people involved, more employees brought into this, I'll say this umbrella, if this is what we're going to do? So back to the League and the author, why are we not taking a look at this in a broader picture? And I appreciate what's going on in today's world, okay? Let's all agree to that. But if we're going to do this, now might be the time to actually take some bold steps in terms of expanding the scope of this.
I believe that was directed towards Councilor Beatty. Would you like to address that?
Yes, Mr. Chair, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Representative Fabian. The League's policy actually is a broader policy that we've had for several years, as I stated in my opening remarks, and it does expand to public employees involved in gross misconduct, and we do have some parameters of what that means. The League does welcome the opportunity to talk through some additional changes and reforms. We were very much involved in the appellate proceedings to try to vacate arbitration awards that have been discussed tonight, the Richfield and the Duluth. And it is a broader issue, I think, with respect to the standard of review when an arbitrator makes a decision overturning a discipline decision by a police chief or a city manager. So yes, it is broader. There are steps, and so this is one of the steps. We do support it. Is the selection of arbitrators will address part of the problem.
Representative Fabian, anything else?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative Herr and I were talking earlier about the stakeholders and so forth, and she said what line are you referring to. I went back and I had to bring up that on my computer as well. So when you go to line 2.9 and 2.10 in the bill, it says, the governor in consultation with the community and law enforcement stakeholders shall appoint a roster, and then of course they change that from 25 to 6. So again, tell me specifically who are the law enforcement stakeholders?
Representative Herr?
Chair Sundin, Representative Fabian, stakeholder is a very broad term. And the purpose of this is to ensure that there is broad community input into this, that partners into this. And so this stakeholder is broad, and it does include anybody who is, for the traditional term of what stakeholder means, that is part of the community or law enforcement, or any issue, anybody who is particularly impacted by this. I don't know how.
Thank you.
That.
Thank you. Representative Vogel, did you have something?
Mr. Chair.
Oh, go ahead, Representative Fabian.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. So again, this is kind of a hypothetical, but it gets to the crux of the bill. So let's say that the 6 arbitrators are appointed. Are they, Mr. Chair, and to the author, are they appointed on a one-time basis for each thing that comes forward, or is that a permanent appointment as an arbitrator?
Representative Herr, please.
Thank you, Chair Sundin, and Representative, was it Fabian that asked the question?
Yes.
Yes.
So this still keeps all of the arbitrators' qualifications and how long they stay, or if they're removed. The Bureau of the Minnesota Bureau of Mediation Services, they have all of the rules within their area that actually still oversees this. So we're not telling them to change how they currently either bring arbitrators on, or how they choose to keep them, or how they use their roster, because they currently have a roster of 25 to 60 arbitrators right now, which they oversee. And so once this group is appointed, they are still overseen by the Bureau of Mediation. So it doesn't change their current rules right now, how that impacts arbitrating.
But, okay.
Thank you, Representative Fabian.
Mr. Chair, so then how are the 6 chosen for each action that might be taken, each incident?
Representative Herr.
Thank you, Chair. Representative Fabian. So that is that we do provide how this is done. And so the selection of arbitrators, if you go down to that section, so it's saying that they will be appointed, if you look at line 2.22 by section, it'll be based on a random or rotating basis.
Thank you. Representative Fabian.
Okay. So then real quickly, Mr. Chair, I think, so if an action is started, how does that start? So when Chief Weiss or Tuscan starts this process, how does that start, and how does it proceed forward?
Representative Herr.
It would start, and Chair Sundin and Representative Fabian, it would start the exact same way it starts now. It doesn't change how you initiate it. All it changes, and I want to just be really clear, all this bill does is change that there is a pool of people that specifically looks at police misconduct. That's all that it does. It doesn't change the arbitration process. It doesn't change the rules within arbitration. It just changes that pool and creates a new pool. And those individuals only oversee police issues.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, there's
Representative Fabian.
Mr. Chair, I really struggle with this. I just and I appreciate Chief Weiss and Tuscan what they're going through, but I think if we're going to do this, I'm curious. Did Representative Garofalo ask for a hearing on his bill that would have made it for a more broad scope of employees? Did he ask for a hearing in your committee on this?
Are you asking me?
I am, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
No, I haven't had any contact in regards to that.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Vogel, you had your hand up at one point.
Yes, I did, Mr. Chair, but I think Representative Mecklin and Hornstein had it in first. But as long as I did have one question of Representative Herr. You told, and as the questioning was going on here, you told me this was specific because these people were carrying a gun and nobody else was. As you went through that definition for peace officer or peace officers. Can you assure me that every one of those then in this bill is carrying a gun? Because that seemed to be the separating point between my suggestion that maybe social workers, teachers, whoever, that are interacting with people, but that seemed to be your qualifying event. And I'm just curious if you could I'd like assurance that the intent here is that unless they're carrying a gun, that they wouldn't be included.
Representative Herr.
Chair, Representative Vogel. Sorry, my throat's getting dry because it's going a lot longer than I thought it was. Thank you for the question. I'm not quite sure what I said that maybe gave the perception that that is the qualifying. I talked a great deal about the disparities that exist in the police and how they police and who is policed. I talked a great deal about the institutional racism that exists within these structures. I talked a great deal about the financial incentive around how arbitrators are chosen. I talked a great deal about all of the current process and how we got to where. So I guess I don't know why having a gun is the defining factor here. Yes, some people have, and I'm specifically referring to the fact that it was officers who are given the ability to have force, and yes, they have a gun. And so, if there's a perception that a gun is the only thing that is the issue within this, within what we're addressing here, then I guess we have a much bigger problem to address than just the fact that we should probably be dismantling systems that continue to put police officers who shouldn't be on the job back into the job.
Thank you. Representative Vogel?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm nearly certain that you use that as the defining thing, that they're carrying a gun, and the other people I was talking about wasn't. So that was my question, and I know we're getting late, Mr. Chair. I'm not going to belabor it, but I think that's what I was told. Thank you.
Thank you. Who is up next? Representative Hornstein or Meckland?
It's possible that I think Representative Mecklen's hand was up before mine.
Representative Meckland, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Chair Sundin. Representative Herr, a question that I have is, in this bill, why are we not trying to reform the use of force, but only the arbitration? If this whole thing, I mean, it all kind of, we all saw what happened, and none of us like it. None of us do. So why is there nothing about like the retrain of use of force, but only about arbitration, which I agree that there is some complications there, which I think Representative Garofalo has some good ideas there. But why do we not have a conversation about literally the use of force? If you could help me answer that question, thank you.
Representative Herr, please.
Chair, Representative, actually that is being addressed, just not in this bill. I'm not sure if you're aware, but the Posse Caucus has put together a big suite of bills that would address everything from accountability to reimagining what police would look like. And so that actually does exist, and it is happening. And I don't think that they'll be coming through to your committee, but all of the information is out there if you are interested in reading it. But there is use of force that is being addressed right now.
Thank you. Follow up on that?
No, thank you. That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Representative Hornstein is up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And real quickly, I just want to respond to some of the earlier conversation regarding the fact that I do strongly believe that this is, in fact, a statewide issue. We heard, earlier today in our debate, and I was following the debate a little bit on the Senate floor today. And there now seems to be this theme that, this is just a Minneapolis problem or a metro problem in terms of the relationship between police and Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And I think it is absolutely a statewide problem. If you look at Northwest Minnesota, we've had migrant workers living there for decades in the Red River Valley. We've had Indigenous people in Northwest Minnesota for centuries. And I think their perspective on this issue and their perspective with regard to a variety of issues involving discrimination, bias, and including interactions with law enforcement, those voices need to be heard, and they are out there. And so, to somehow suggest that this is just a Minneapolis issue, I think is not correct. And I just wanted to make sure that was stated. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Representative Hornstein. Representative Fabian.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, oh boy. Representative Hornstein, I like you a lot. And I think that you're mischaracterizing what's going on in Northwest Minnesota, but you and I can have a conversation at another time about that. Mr. Chair, on Saturday, I asked you about the Garofalo bill, House File 14. On Saturday, June 13th, email was sent to Mr. Reese, Travis Reese, and Michael Moeller requesting a hearing on House File 14 in the Labor Committee. So I just want to get that on the record that was there. I would think that it would be a good idea for you, Mr. Chair, to do that, to have a hearing on Representative Garofalo's bill so that the people can hear what the differences are between what we're hearing today on the HER bill and the House File 14.
Thank you very much. I'll look into that. Appreciate your comments.
Thank you.
Representative Cagle.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I'm sorry.
So I just wanted to say that Representative Herr, you're amazing. I don't think I could have done what you have done with such class and dignity. I also want to say that Representative Fabian, I can understand why you don't think that there is systemic racism, because when you live in an area that's 98% white, you probably don't have very many neighbors or friends that tend to be people of color. So I would definitely suggest maybe, you know, coming down and having those conversations, walking in the neighborhoods of the where these people live to see what's really going on. And then I also wanted to ask Chief Wise, who is a chief of one of the cities that I represent. This provision is supported by the Police Chiefs Association, correct? Minnesota Chief of Police Association.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative Cagle. The Minnesota Chiefs of Police Association is formally moving forward with a recommendation that administrative law judges handle discipline arbitrations for police officers. The purpose is the same. Administrative law judges are full-time employees that make decisions. They're not people who are contractors that are paid for being assigned a particular arbitration. So yeah, there's competing interests that are in and around state government as proposals right now. And frankly, I'm just anxious for something to move forward so that discipline decisions are made more by police chiefs and less via 50-50 proposition of arbitrators who don't live in the communities that we work in.
Thank you. And
thank you, Chief. Representative Cagle.
Mr. Chair and Chief Wise, how many chiefs of police are part of that organization? Do you know offhand? I looked on the website and I couldn't find the roster.
Chair, Representative Cagle, I think it's something around 400 police chiefs throughout the state of Minnesota. But again, it's this particular item has been talked about for years. The idea that a local police chief has more to say about a termination in particular than an arbitrator who might fly in from another state, hear a case, make a decision, and then fly home to wherever it is that they came from. At essence, that's what this is about and what we're looking for.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. The time is growing short, and we have to go through a couple of roll call votes here yet. So,
Mr. Chair, this is
Representative Fabian.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate that. I think it was Chief Weiss that was just talking. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. So, Chief Weiss, and again, I respect you greatly, and I agree with you that the chiefs should be making more decisions. Just as I also agree that the principals and superintendents, as a former school teacher, not an administrator, principals and superintendents should be making more decisions. And I think that this conversation this evening actually starts a process to where we can get to a better place across the state of Minnesota. And Representative Cagle, I would ask you also, when was the last time you spent 3 or 4 nights in a row in a town of 400 people or less in a city more than 150 miles from the capital?
Representative Fabian, Mr. Chair, last week.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, especially the chiefs there for their valuable input. Seeing no other hands up, I'm going to renew my motion that House File 72 as amended be referred to the Committee on Ways and Means. All those in, okay, we're going to do a roll call on this. Kyle Smith will take the roll.
Chair Sundin.
Aye.
Representative Cagle.
Aye.
Representative Vogel.
No.
Representative Brand.
Aye.
Representative Detmer.
No.
Representative Eklund.
Yes.
Representative Fabian.
No.
Representative Hornstein.
Aye.
Representative Lippert.
Aye.
Representative Meckland.
Okay.
Representative Nelson M.
Aye.
Jay.
Representative Nelson N.
No.
Representative Purcell.
Aye.
Representative Jean.
Oh, did you?
And Representative Claflin. My apologies, I missed you.
Aye.
Oh, okay.
That's 5
Representative
noes and 10 ayes.
Certainly. Okay, the motion prevails. We have 2 other issues to take up. A roll call vote on the Stephenson bill. Hearing all the discussion already, the clerk will take the roll on the Stephenson House File 63 bill.
Representative Sundin.
Aye.
Representative Cagle.
Aye.
Representative Vogel.
Aye.
Representative Brand.
Aye.
Representative Claflin.
Aye.
Representative Detmer.
Aye.
Representative Eklund.
Aye.
Representative Fabian.
Aye.
Representative Hornstein.
Aye.
Representative Lippert.
Aye.
Representative Meckland.
Aye.
Representative Nelson M.
Aye.
Representative Nelson N.
Aye.
Representative Purcell.
Aye.
Representative Jean.
Aye.
That's 15 ayes, 0 noes.
Certainly, so the motion prevails. We also have a roll call vote requested for Senate File 15, the bill presented by Representative Tabke. Clerk will take the roll.
Representative Sundin.
Aye.
Representative Cagle.
Aye.
Representative Vogel.
Aye.
Representative Brand.
Aye.
Representative Claflin.
Aye.
Representative Detmer.
Aye.
Representative Eklund.
Aye.
Representative Fabian.
Aye.
Representative Hornstein.
Aye.
Representative Lippert.
Aye.
Representative Meckland.
Aye.
Representative Nelson M.
Aye.
Representative Nelson N.
Aye.
Representative Purcell.
Aye.
Representative Jean.
Aye.
15 ayes and 0 noes.
Thank you. The motion prevails then. Seeing no other business before the committee, I'll call for adjournment after we wish Bob Detmer good health. We're adjourned. Thank you.
Amen to that.